It's a sure thing now.
Always. If you know you have friends or family joining, now's the time to give them a little nudge, text them, ping them, carrier pigeon, whichever way you need to let them know we're going to start soon.
You can definitely do that right now. Rena, quick question. How do these type of things go? What's the protocol for this? Like is it a class, interactive? Just out of curiosity.
So we have Carly, who's going to give an incredible overview of anti-Semitism, what it looks like. She's going to give some tools on how to combat it, how to identify it, define it, take action. And then my part, in terms of answering tough questions, it's more of like a skill workshop rather than content. So that'll be interactive.
Just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, awesome. Should we get started?
Sure.
Okay, guys. So this was a small event just to have a few community members join. Last week we had Enough is Enough event by Hussein Abu Bakr, who gave his story about how he went from an anti-Semite to an advocate for Israel. Now today we're going to see how we can answer and combat questions against Israel and against the Jewish nation. And that's it. Rena, if you would like to give a little introduction, please go ahead.
Sure. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm sure there are other things you could be doing right now, like setting your New Year's resolutions or whatever you might want to be doing, but it's so incredibly amazing that you're here. You're here because you understand that anti-Semitism is happening all around us, especially in the year of 2020. We saw so many horrific anti-Semitic incidents. Some of them made the news and some of them really didn't. Today, we're so fortunate to be joined by Carly Gamel, who is the director of the Center of Combating Anti-Semitism at StandWithUs. For those of you that don't know StandWithUs, we're an Israel education organization that's really inspired by our love of Israel and our commitment to defending Israel wherever necessary and fighting anti-Semitism. Oftentimes those things go hand in hand. I think all of you or most of you have had experiences like that we'll get to talk about. So we're going to start the program with Carly, who's going to give an incredible overview of what anti-Semitism looks like here and now, and what are the tools we can utilize, the steps we can take in order to combat it. One fun fact about Carly, being the director of the Center for Combating Anti-Semitism, she's not Jewish. Carly has made this commitment to this work because she recognizes how deeply rooted anti-Semitism is. She has taken it upon herself professionally to combat it. Now, if that's not incredibly inspirational before she gets started, I don't know what is. Carly, whenever you're ready, we are excited and eager to learn all about what anti-Semitism looks like and what we can do to fight it.
Great. Thanks, Rena. I appreciate that. That was a flattering introduction. I hope I can live up to it. So first of all, I just want to applaud those of you who are here. You're taking time out of your less maybe busy than usual life in 2020, but still busy. As Rena said, you all have other things that could be taking up your time. And so the fact that you're here, that this is important enough for you to take that time in the evening to sit and listen and educate yourselves. Again, I applaud you, and I encourage you to continue to do these types of things, and then to take what you hear and what you learn here and use it where you can. As Rena said, I'm the director of the Stand With Us Center for Combating Anti-Semitism. And really what that means is, we decided a couple of years ago that although Stand With Us has always had as part of the core mission fighting anti-Semitism, there really needed to be a concerted effort. And that was because we were realizing that there were 4 areas when it comes to anti-Semitism that really needed to be addressed. And those are identifying anti-Semitism, because people generally have a difficult time doing that. And we realized that in order to do that, we really need to have a consistent definition that people are using when we talk about anti-Semitism, so that, if you have the definition, then it becomes much more easy to identify it. Then exposing it. There's certain circumstances and situations where it just really does need to be exposed for what it is. And then taking action where we can and how we can. And the reality is sometimes the only action we can take is exposing it. Other times there's education to be done. Sometimes there's legal action that we can take. And so those are the 4 kind of key areas that the Center for Combating Anti-Semitism focuses on. And the way we do that is really kind of 2-pronged. And what we're doing here tonight is really the crux and the bulk of what we do, which is education. And so I'm going to just kind of dive into a little bit what Rena asked me to talk about. First of all, is just a little bit about the history of anti-Semitism. And certainly we don't have time for a full history. I mean, we're talking thousands and thousands of years of bias against and hatred against and discrimination against the Jewish people. So that's a whole other seminar that I'm sure we could do and would take much longer. But here's the thing that I think it's important to know about the history of anti-Semitism. Like other forms of xenophobia, it really stems from this kind of fear of, mistrust of, misunderstanding of the other, something that's unfamiliar, something that's not understood. And there are as many reasons for anti-Semitism as there are manifestations of it, maybe as many reasons as there are people who engage in it. It's not an easy thing to pinpoint why is there anti-Semitism exactly, except for that one thing. I do think that it stems from a fear of and a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding of the other. And sometimes when things are bad in society or in the culture, things are difficult, we as human beings, we look for someone or something to blame. And historically, throughout the centuries, the Jewish people have proven to be one of the primary targets of that. And so if you look at society and how it's evolved through the centuries, and I'll say that what I'm about to share, I largely have stolen from Rabbi Sachs, because I think he put it so well. And if you guys haven't seen the whiteboard videos that Rabbi Sachs created and uploaded, they're phenomenal. They're maybe 3 to 5 minutes, and they're just a really easy way to conceptualize a lot of what we're talking about here. So I would encourage you to check that out. But in one of them, he talks about how anti-Semitism has, as a virus, essentially, has mutated and morphed throughout history. And the way that it's done that really is that a society any given society at any given time generally has, kind of certain concepts or ideas, principles that are like the highest ideals. And so if we look back, at ancient anti-Semitism all the way through the Middle Ages, for society as a whole, religion really was kind of the highest ideal, morals and religion. And so a lot of the manifestations that we saw during that time in history of anti-Semitism were aimed at Jews as a religious group. And so that's where we get the blood libel, for example, or this idea that Jews are somehow just inherently immoral and corrupt and are forcing their immorality upon the rest of the world. And again, that appealed to that society because that was contrary to the religious values of the time. And I should say this too. One of the ways that generally, and I think I said this a second ago, but that generally you see anti-Semitism kind of coming out and manifesting is through the scapegoating of the Jewish people, blaming, again, someone. We need someone to blame for what's wrong, right? And so again, at that time, the plague, the Jewish people were heavily blamed and targeted as the cause of the plague and perpetuating it, right? But some of that had to do with a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding of certain Jewish religious rituals. And so, and because there was so much washing of hands and washing, and cleanliness among the Jewish people that maybe wasn't there amongst the rest of the society, the in per capita, the Jews were not experiencing the same kind of suffering. And so in the minds of the society, well, why is that? Well, they must be then to blame for it, right? They're causing this for everyone else and not for themselves. Okay. I mean, today we understand that that's completely irrational and illogical, but at the time, again, that was one of the primary manifestations. If you fast forward to the 19th century and then to the early 20th century, religion was kind of, heading out the door a little bit in terms of the height of society and what society looked to as an ideal. And it became this study of race and ethnicity and scientific, the so-called scientific study of race. And so, we can easily recall the principles and tenets of Nazism and the way that the Nazi regime perpetrated and perpetuated anti-Semitic ideas was based on Jews as an inferior race. And so, you get ideas like not just that Jews are inferior, but comparisons between Jews and animals, spiders and pigs. And, it's disgusting, when we think about this, and it should have been disgusting at the time to anyone of good faith. But again, we're talking about a society that they're focused on the purity of race and ethnicity. And so anything that's different, that's other, and that is, again, continually being touted as less than, as inferior, and an easy scapegoat, an easy place to, to lay blame. That's what the Jewish people provided at that time. And so again, at that time, there were wars and, there was lots of civil unrest. And so again, is there somebody or some group of people that we can blame? And that became the Jews. So if we fast forward again to more contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism, sure, we still get, bias against Jews based on religious notions and ideas. And yes, we still get, bias against Jews based on this idea of race or ethnicity. But what it looks like today, more and more often, those manifestations are based on human rights principles. Well, what's the, when we think about Israel and the claims that are made against Israel today, it's that Israel is the worst human rights violator, right? I mean, this New Jersey-sized democracy in the middle of, nothing, surrounded by enemy nations, basically hostile nations, and somehow, and we ignore China and we ignore Syria, and some of the things that have gone on there. We ignore everywhere else in the world that we're seeing people exterminated, essentially gross human rights violations, and we focus exclusively on Israel as the, the greatest human rights violator. And again, that's because in our society, the more progressive society that we live in, that's basically kind of our highest ideal, is how are other humans being treated, the idea of human rights and social justice. And so if we can, again, place blame on a people or a people group for the problems that we see in society, then here's how we scapegoat the Jews now as the Jewish collective state of Israel. So in a nutshell, that's a really quick history lesson in terms of just kind of how anti-Semitism has looked and has mutated, as Rabbi Sachs has said, or morphed or transformed. And the reality is, though, none of it gets left behind, right? So we don't, as I said a moment ago, we don't lose the religion-based anti-Semitism. We don't lose the race or ethnicity-based. We just keep adding to, as society evolves. Oh, here's another reason to hate the Jews or to blame the Jews. And so again, you've all heard some of the Israel-related anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic rhetoric, things like claiming that Jews, whether specific Jews or Jews as a whole, are have dual loyalty to whatever country they live in, but also to Israel, and that somehow their loyalty to Israel is greater than their loyalty to where they actually live and are citizens. Double standards. If you're not familiar with Natan Sharansky's 3Ds of anti-Semitism, that's the double standards being applied to Israel, right? Things that are expected by the world community of Israel that are not expected or demanded of any other democracy. Demonization, demonizing Israel for real or imagined harms, but then also taking that and applying that to Jews as a whole because of some perceived connection with Israel, because it is the Jewish state. Or finally, delegitimization, right? Claiming that Israel, and only Israel, because it is a Jewish state, has no right to exist. Claiming that the right of self-determination of the Jewish people does not exist. Claiming that, for example, that Israel is a racist endeavor because it is a Jewish state. So this is kind of the latest manifestation of anti-Semitism. And it's what probably you all hear most often. I know it's what we hear from the students that we work with on college campuses and high schools, even that, and it falls under more the broad term of anti-Zionism. And so I want to take just a minute to really kind of focus in on that term, because this kind of feeds into some of the tools that are available to combat the current forms of anti-Semitism that we're seeing. And I guess I'll say this before I get into that. If we're talking about physical assaults, which yes, are still occurring, and for those of you who are in the New York area, obviously, you're seeing that more and more, perhaps more per capita than anywhere else in the country right now. Those things generally have to be fought through law enforcement. I mean, that's criminal activity, and and I don't want to say there's nothing that we as private citizens can do, but the things that we're going to talk about can affect that, and hopefully will affect that, just more indirectly. So the tools that are available to us, maybe aren't directly going to deal with, fixing, correcting that type of, the physical side of anti-Semitism and in terms of assaults. So I'll hold off on those tools for just a minute, because again, I really do think it's important to delve into the notion of anti-Zionism a little more in depth just for a minute. And for this reason, one of the things we're going to talk about is in a little bit, and Rena's going to really focus on, is dialogue and how we do that when it comes to combating anti-Semitism, and specifically answering tough questions about Israel. And so that's why I think this is really important. A lot of times what we hear from people is this statement or this position of, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. And that's a real, and Rena, if I'm stealing your thunder, I'm sorry. But that's a really difficult one for a lot of people. And one of the things that I feel really, really strongly about right now is that we can simplify that, and it does not need to be difficult. And here's why, and here's how I suggest that we do that. I think it's crucial when you hear something like that, a claim of anti-Zionism and some attempt to distinguish it from anti-Semitism. We have to make sure that we understand the terminology that's being used and the meaning of the words being used, right? Because if you make the assumption that you and the other person or people involved mean the same thing by the word anti-Zionism, you're very likely going to be wrong. um, but even more important than that, you may both have a misunderstanding of what that word actually means. And in order to understand what anti-Zionism is, right, in order to get a clear definition of that, we first have to understand, well, what is Zionism, right? And so some people, and this is why the claim is made, right? I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. Because a lot of people think that Zionism is much narrower than what it really is. They, in their minds, Zionism is just a political movement or a political position, right? The political movement that led to the current political state of Israel, right? So it's just a political position, and so it's fine to be anti-Zionist if it's just a political position with which you disagree. Um, a lot of people think it's just support for the state of Israel. In general, I support Israel. So there are limited, kind of too narrow views of what Zionism is. And so I think if we start at the beginning and start with a proper understanding of what Zionism actually is, then that helps us in going forward. And here's what Zionism actually is. And it's much broader. And I think it's important that we all understand that when we're having these conversations. It's much broader than a political position. It's much broader than just a sense of support. Zionism is a component of identity for many Jews, right? Certainly not for all. And I liken this to other groups, right? I'm not, as Rena said, I'm not Jewish. I'm a Christian, right? My Christian identity isn't identical to anyone else's, right? But that doesn't mean that someone gets to tell me what is and isn't actually a part of my Christian identity, right? So for many Jews, right, Zionism is very much an integral part of what it means to be Jewish, right? And so if you understand, first of all, that broad concept, that it's not a political view, it's not just an emotional connection to Israel, that it is truly a part of Jewish identity. And it may be expressed in a number of different ways. It may be expressed by some through the way they practice their religion. It may be expressed, by others through cultural manifestations. There are many different manifestations, but it makes no difference to the reality that it is part of identity, no less than if you express your Judaism or your Jewishness, for lack of a better word, by wearing a kippah or by observing Shabbat. Those things we understand as part of Jewish identity and expressions of Jewish identity. And we also understand that because of that if someone is treated badly, right, worse than others because they do those things, right, we understand that that's discrimination, that's anti-Jewish discrimination, that's anti-Semitism. We have to start understanding that anti-Zionism, if we understand that Zionism is a component of Jewish identity, then there's no other logical conclusion than the fact that anti-Zionism is also anti-Jewish discrimination. It's anti-Semitism. Because here's what it's saying. If you understand that Zionism is saying that the existence of a Jewish state in the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people in Israel, the right of self-determination of the Jewish people to live there, to live out their Judaism, Jewishness in that environment, that's what Zionism is, and that for many Jews, that is a part of their identity. Then to say I am anti-Zionist is to say I'm fine with every other people group having the right of self-determination, and they can express that in their homeland or in their chosen location, just not the Jewish people. That's discrimination. And so if we have that understanding, I think going into conversations about anti-Zionism and whether in fact that is anti-Semitism, or again, more likely what you're going to hear is the attempt to make that distinction, then it becomes much easier to cut through that and say, okay, you know what, I don't think we mean the same thing. Here's what Zionism actually is, and so here's what anti-Zionism is. So once you kind of get that level playing field, then it becomes much easier to have that conversation, and also to make it clear, if this is what Zionism is, and you claim to be an anti-Zionist, you can't get around the fact that you're discriminating against the Jewish people and only the Jewish people. So again, I hope that that made sense, and makes sense also why that's so important as we go into some of the discussion about how to combat the types of things that we are regularly hearing today. I think that the other thing that's really important to understand as we're having these conversations is motive, right? Some anti-Semitism, I mean, if something is anti-Semitic, it just is, right? But just like if something is blue, it just is, right? Or if something is a dog, it just is. There's identifying something for what it is shouldn't be that difficult. What can be difficult, though, is discerning motive. Not everyone who engages in anti-Semitism, especially anti-Semitic speech, understands that that's what they're doing. They don't necessarily mean to be discriminatory because they just don't understand it. We see that a lot. We've seen it more and more, especially through the pandemic, as everything has moved online and social media. We've been seeing just rampant anti-Semitism. A lot of it, yes, is intentional by people who have clear bias or truly hate Jews for some reason. But a fair amount of it, and I think a lot of it that we see from celebrities, I don't think they really understand. They don't understand what they're saying, what the implications are of what they're saying. A lot of it they've just heard forever, and they don't even understand that it's offensive or discriminatory. And so I think the first thing you have to do when you hear these types of things and see these things is try to discern the motive, right? Do they just have misinformation or a lack of information, or are they truly intending to be anti-Semitic? Because how you deal with those situations is completely different, right? If we're talking about somebody who absolutely intends to be anti-Semitic, we can still attempt to have that dialogue and have that discussion with them. But we also understand that it's much less likely that in a conversation, we're going to change their minds, right? Maybe they need some education, but there's something more going on there. But the people who truly just don't understand what anti-Semitism is, and they don't know that that's what they're saying or hearing, if it's something that they've heard and they're repeating, that's a whole lot easier to have that conversation, to provide some education and some information, and then hopefully affect something of a change in what's being said and being perpetrated. So I think that's also really an important tool to kind of have in the belt of being able to discern what's the motive here. We tell our students all the time, we talk about the 10-80-10 rule, right? That generally, and it's an estimate, right? But that generally 10% of the population is with us, right? They agree with us. We make up 10% maybe of the population, people who believe that understand what anti-Semitism is, believe that it's wrong, it's discriminatory, including anti-Zionism. And then you got about 10% on the far opposite end of the spectrum, who no matter what you say, not going to change their mind. They're anti-Israel, they're anti-Semitic, and that's just deep-seated within them. Most of the population, about, we'd say about 80%, they don't know. They either don't know what they think about this, or what they think is based on a lack of information or misinformation, and that's really the target. And it's a lot of who you're going to encounter. It's the majority of the people you're going to encounter. Excuse me. So again, understanding motive, I think, is important in kind of figuring out who is it that I'm talking to, and so what are my tactics going to be here. So I think the three primary tools and ways that I generally encourage people to combat anti-Semitism. First is I think key, it's crucial, it's what I do professionally, but it doesn't have to be professional, and it's education. And that can be formal, or it can be extremely informal. Again, having a conversation. But it generally has to be pretty intentional. Right? I mean, if you're in a conversation and you hear something, you have to purpose within your mind, within yourself, to say, okay, I need to provide some accurate information to counter, what I'm hearing and what this person obviously either believes or at least is repeating. So it does have to be a very intentional thing. And in order for that to take place, you have to first educate yourself, right? So again, that's why I applauded you at the beginning of this for being here, for caring enough to try to get some more education. But you have a sphere of influence. We all do, right? I mean, I do this professionally, excuse me, but I also do it personally. I have a sphere of influence. I have family members. I attend social events, and there are social groups, that I spend time with. I have opportunities both professionally and personally to speak with elected officials, with school administrators, whether it's campus, high school, elementary, whatever that may be, law enforcement personnel, spiritual leaders. I mean, these are all people that we encounter on a regular basis, maybe not in person right now, but on a regular basis, we have the opportunity to interact with these people. And so part of, I think, being intentional is not just waiting for the conversation to happen and being responsive, but being proactive. Excuse me, I should have some water with me and I don't. Being proactive about saying, okay, I know that this is a problem in the culture and I want to do something about it. So, approaching a spiritual leader, or if you are friends with someone who happens to be an elected official or a school administrator, and saying, I'm trying to be more proactive about a problem in society, and I was wondering if there's a group, if it's a school administrator, could I come talk to the teachers, or is this, could we have Stand With Us come talk to the teachers, or whatever the right fit is, but being proactive about the people who are within your sphere of influence, and saying, I recognize that there are many people who are misinformed or just aren't informed at all about what's going on and the problem that it poses, and the fact that they can do something about it. Because if we're dealing with this and trying to educate people within our sphere of influence, right, then they have the opportunity with that knowledge and that information to do the same, and then those people do the same, and it's a snowball effect. I can't educate everybody. Rena can't educate everybody, but the people that we educate then have the opportunity to go on, and like I said, it grows that way. So again, being intentional about taking the information and the knowledge that you acquire, and then saying, okay, what groups of people do I have the opportunity to share this with? I talk to our students all the time. And one of the things that I share with them, and so it's just an example, is again, growing up in a Christian family, I think about on any given Sunday morning, I was probably in Sunday school. And I think about the immense difference that I think it would have made. I mean, obviously I ended up here, so that's great. But there are a lot of people who, who are good people, well-meaning people, sitting in churches of various denominations on any given Saturday or Sunday, right? And they just don't know a whole lot about the Jewish people or Judaism. And I think about the impact it would have made on me as, say, a 10, 11, 12-year-old, if I had been sitting there one Sunday morning and my Sunday school teacher had walked in and said, class, today we have a guest speaker, and this is Rena, and Rena's Jewish, and given a little bit of background about what that means, and then said, Rena's just going to talk to us about what it means to be Jewish. And whether she talked about that from a faith perspective or from a cultural perspective, or, just what that means. And the reason I think that would have been so impactful, and I think it would continue to be so, is, first of all, we're talking about young people, right? Impressionable at a young age, but the opportunity for them to learn from an early age about somebody who's completely different from them in many ways. And it makes people feel less other, right? And less concerned about or confused about people who are other and who are different. And again, as I said at the very beginning, I think, like many forms of xenophobia, anti-Semitism is perpetuated because of misunderstandings or lack of understandings, and this sense of, well, they're other and they're different. And so I think and again, I just use the Sunday school thing as an example of one way that that any given person could be intentional about reaching out to a different community of people and saying, this is who I am. And because here's the reality, it's really difficult to hate somebody that you actually know. And especially if you learn about them and get to like something about them. So another example that I use with the kids a lot is, if you're talking about junior high or high school kids, maybe your general sphere of influence are people who are generally like you, right? Maybe most of your friends are Jewish, but it requires intentionality, and it requires kind of stepping outside of your comfort zone. But what if you tried to develop relationships with some other people, maybe who don't share the same background, the same faith, but they like video games as much as you do, or they like skateboarding as much as you do, and finding commonalities and ways to relate, and then again, it's just about getting to know people and building relationships, which then helps to build bridges between different communities. I mean, we see, think about the movies, the feel-good movies, that we've all seen. A lot of them are about people of different backgrounds that, become the unlikeliest of friends. And then there's something about them, that maybe, um, whatever that connection is, that, they would fight to the death for the other one, right? When they're being mistreated, that kind of thing. And so I just feel like there's no substitute for just being ourselves and developing those relationships and building those bridges. And again, I think that feeds back into giving the opportunity to educate in a very informal way, just talking about your experiences, your parents' experiences, your grandparents' experiences, whatever that is. And like I said, that's the more informal thing. But then you can also, if depending on who you are and what relationships you may already have, you can also, try to develop a way to do a little bit of a more formal type of education. And that's why I say, if you have someone in your life who's already in a position of authority or influence over others who maybe could use this education, using that relationship to try to further some of that education. And if you're not familiar with Stand With Us, one of the things that we are known for, because we are an educational organization, our educational resources, our booklets, our videos, things like that, they're phenomenal. Most of them are easily digestible. Some of them are a little longer and more involved reads, but most of them are really, really approachable. And so it's a good way for you to educate yourself, but then also to share with others. I talked earlier, I'm gonna wrap up here. I talked earlier about identifying anti-Semitism and the importance of, in order to identify it, of having a consistent definition. One of the tools that we are using, just I mean, all over. I mean, I can't think of a context right now in which we're educating, in which we're not talking about and trying to take advantage of this tool. And it's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, so the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Many of you have probably heard about it or have some familiarity with it. I cannot encourage you enough to familiarize yourself with that. I think it will help tremendously, especially if you have an opportunity to talk to other influencers and share with them about anti-Semitism and encourage them to learn more. The great thing about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is it goes beyond just saying, here's what anti-Semitism is, and it provides 11 different examples of contemporary anti-Semitism. And they're things that, again, you'll probably all be able to relate to, not necessarily maybe I've experienced that personally, but at least in terms of what you've seen and heard just in the society and in the culture. And so being able to, to identify examples of situations that may be anti-Semitic, and it's a tremendous tool in helping others who aren't as familiar with it. And I think I would be remiss in talking about that and any of this if I didn't also say one of the other keys. I talked about being able to try to discern motive, and I think that is really key when we're having these conversations and trying to do this type of education. But one of the other things that I just think is absolutely crucial is approaching these issues, and you're going to get into this a little bit here in just a minute with Rena, approaching these issues with nuance, right? Yes, I love Israel. Yes, Rena loves Israel, but we also know that Israel is not perfect. It's human beings, right? There is no institution made up of human beings that does not have some flaws and has not made some mistakes, and or couldn't be improved in some ways. So being able to have these conversations with the nuance that's necessary, and not just going into it with a blanket black white kind of approach. And again, I won't steal Rena's thunder on any further in terms of what she's going to be sharing with you. But I think when you get through with the kind of skills part of the evening, you'll understand that a little bit better in terms of finding common ground and approaching things with nuance, but also being able to provide some factual information that hopefully, moves the meter a little bit in terms of where people are education-wise on these issues. And ultimately, the whole goal of education with anything, but especially, certainly with anti-Semitism, is so that we can deter the furtherance of it, right? I mean, we don't just want people to know what it is so that they know. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge doesn't generally do us any good. It's knowledge for the sake of changing, future, the outcomes, future behavior and conduct. And all of this just, kind of feeds into that. And so the last tool that I will mention is there are times when education just isn't going to do it. Building bridges and building relationships maybe just isn't sufficient. And, it needs to be reported. I mean, there are just times that's what has to happen, and authorities need to know about it. So on the Stand With Us website, as well as on the separate CCA website, there is I think it's a red, banner button up in the top right corner. I think Rena already put the website up, the link to it, but where you can report anti-Semitism. And the thing about our tool that's just a little bit different from others, and I encourage you to take a look at it, is, as I mentioned, especially since everything seems to be on social media right now, and more and more so just in the world that we live in virtually. The bulk of what we're seeing is online anti-Semitism, right? Not that we're not seeing other things, but so much of it is online. And so the thing about our tool, when you report, you also have the opportunity right then and there to, to click on a button that says this was, this was online anti-Semitism. And if you do that, then there's a drop-down box that asks you which platform, and say it was Twitter, you choose Twitter, and immediately a box pops up with a link so that you can report that directly to Twitter. So again, these are all just things that we're trying to do and to provide to make sure that, that the opportunity is there, that we can try to, decrease the volume. Anti-Semitism is not going anywhere. I think we all know that. It's not like, polio, where there's gonna miraculously be a vaccine. I don't think any of us are under that delusion, but that doesn't mean that we can't be effective, and that there aren't ways, tools that we can use to try to decrease the frequency of it. And again, I think the three biggest tools really are education, personal relationships, and then, like I said, when necessary, reporting and exposing that. Again, because if we're reporting, say, to Twitter, then that gives them the opportunity to know about it and to do something about it. While yes, all these social media platforms monitor to an extent, the content on their sites, we're talking about just an immense volume of content. That they're obviously not going to catch everything. And so it's up to us as well to be the eyes and the ears and to help do that. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me. It is a privilege to get to do what I do and to work with fantastic people like Rena. And I'm going to hand it back over to her so that you can learn a little bit more about how to put into practice some of the things that I've been sharing about.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carly. That was incredible. I think one of the most eye-opening things that you shared is that anti-Zionism has really become the new socially accepted form of anti-Semitism.
Right.
And that doesn't mean on college campuses, which is the department that I run here at Stand With Us, that we don't see swastikas on campus, because we still do. It doesn't mean that we don't see individual harassment of Jewish students, which we still do. And it doesn't mean that we don't see things like mezuzot being stolen from people's doorways, which we still do. We still see all of those things. We still see these traditional forms of anti-Semitism. But more often than not, what we see, as Carly said, is this new iteration of anti-Zionism. And that comes in the form of BDS resolutions on campus, where students are asking their student government to boycott Israeli products or divest from Israeli companies. It comes in the form of Apartheid Week, where student clubs like Students for Justice in Palestine bring these huge boards on campus that essentially are aimed at convincing people that Israel is an apartheid state, similar to South Africa, and is oppressing its community of Palestinians the same as what happened in South Africa. So a big part of what we need to do is reclaim these definitions. Zionism has become a dirty word. A few years ago, I spoke to a AE chapter at Binghamton. AE is a very popular Jewish fraternity. And I had asked the brothers who were so pro-Israel, how many of them were pro-Israel? They all raised their hands. And I asked them, how many of you would identify as Zionists? And none of them raised their hands. I then went through an extensive deep dive as to what Zionism is at its root, right? Just like Carly did for us earlier. And then I asked the question again, and everyone raised their hands. So it's very clear that there's a big lack of understanding of what some of these terms mean. And for us who are seeking to educate our peers, it's good for us to know what these terms are and to reclaim them, to make sure that either we are the first ones defining them, or if someone else has tried to define them for us, we're taking that back. We're taking the microphone back. That's a huge part of this conversation. Now, a few points that Carly mentioned that I want to really emphasize. One of them is the 10-80-10 rule. As Carly said, there's this middle 80%, give or take on some of the numbers. I'm not a numbers person, but 80% of people on average tend to not really have opinions based on anything. Now, that doesn't mean that they know they should. I'll explain what I mean. Someone might not know where Israel is on a map, what the conflict is about, but they know they should. They know they should have an opinion because everyone's talking about it. In this day and age, it's not woke, it's not cool to not know what's going on in the world. So what happens more often than not is someone will create an opinion based on different things they hear. Something they read on social media, something they heard from their professor. They will literally sew together what they think is an opinion. And that's what they'll go off of. That 80% needs people like you now more than ever. If they know they should have an opinion, let's make sure that their opinion is rooted in fact. It's rooted in what's actually happening on the ground. And as Carly said, it's nuanced. It's not black and white. It is very clear in what it tells and what people understand. Another thing I want to highlight that Carly mentioned, in terms of different types of anti-Semitism, there are different biases that people come to or develop that influences the types of opinions they form. Everyone has like these filters, their surroundings, things they were told as a kid, the community they're part of, where they live, what country they live in. So many of these different elements, and those are just some of the basics, create a filter over the way someone sees the world. So when we're having conversations with people, when we're educating them and really building a relationship with them, we can peel back those layers, peel back that filter, and really understand why someone thinks the way they do, what brought them to this. If they have very negative things to say about Israelis in Israel, did this person have a really bad experience with an Israeli and that tainted everything they understood? That happens more often than not, right? We get into some type of altercation or we see something we don't like that someone does, and immediately we associate everything, every person that might have that similar identity with that one incident we have. And that's just one example. So these are good things to keep in mind as we are understanding the world around us, as we're understanding who is sharing things and what they're sharing and why they're sharing it, what journey brought them to this point. For me, it's really important that you all not just understand what to say, but how to say it, because it's so critically important. When I was in college, I took an Arabic language class because I was excited to be able to speak Arabic with my grandfather. My Jiddo was born in Syria, and I said, how awesome would it be if I came home one day and I could speak to him fluent Arabic? He'll flip out, he'll love it. And I remember walking into the classroom and noticing right away I'm the only non-Muslim in the class. But that's okay. I went to yeshiva my whole life, Mag and David, and then Flatbush. I hadn't really met people who weren't Jewish before. This was a really cool opportunity. It'd be so incredibly insightful to share the histories of our families and where there's overlap. Now, my professor tells everyone that Arabic is a rich language, beautiful language rooted in culture and history. And there's another language spoken in the Middle East, doesn't really belong there. And maybe one day, if we're lucky, that language won't be there anymore. Now, it's very clear to me what this person is saying, extremely clear, but I didn't say a thing. I didn't say a thing. I knew what she said was wrong, but didn't really know what to do about it, what my options were, where I could have turned, what I could have shared. I could say, yeah, I've been to Israel a bunch of times. They didn't really mean much back then. I knew I loved Israel, but without really having the confidence and skills to approach her, whether in front of the classroom or privately, there's no way I could have overcome that. And that's really what drew me to Stand With Us. That's what brought me to this work. I said, I'm not going to let any other students be in similar situations. I'm going to make sure every student's going to know not just what to say, but how to say it. If someone told you something horrible about Israel or Israelis or Jews, right, and you saw that somewhere, you could easily Google the topic and find your answer. But it's not just about what you say, it is how you say it. How you say it is going to create the space where you can really effectively educate someone. If someone tells you Israel is killing innocent Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and it's horrible and it needs to end, what might your initial response be? How might you respond to that person? You could unmute, feel free.
Well, without having the right knowledge, you probably just say, that's not true.
Right, exactly. Your first instinct, your gut reaction, you're wrong. That's not right. That's not right. That's the first thing you want to scream at someone because that's the first thing you think in your head. That is wrong. That is not correct. The minute you say that to someone, they're shut down. They're like, oh, you're one of those guys. You're on the other side of the camp. There's nothing for us to talk about. Immediately, they are seeing you as the other, and you could, in their heads, you could not be farther apart from them. They're not interested. The methodology or the strategy that we teach at Stand With Us when it comes to answering tough questions about any topic, not just Israel or anti-Semitism, is with ARM. The method itself is called ARM. The first thing you want to do, A, is address what the person is saying. You want to tell that person, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. You want to be able to see, do we have common ground? Is there something we have in common that can show you I'm not that different from you? So don't automatically shut me out. For that example, something I might say is my address. I might say, innocent people in the Gaza Strip are suffering every day. I agree with you. And I'm so happy you brought this up because this upsets me also. It's something I care about also. And your transition point, I want to talk about why. I want to talk about what is the root of that suffering? Where does that suffering come from? Who is causing it? Already within just that sentence or two alone, I'm telling this person, I want to have a conversation with you. And I care about the same thing you do. And we have the same thing in common, that we're upset that innocent people are suffering. The second part of this methodology is reframe. Here's where you put in your facts. Here's where you put in your points. You know, contrary to popular belief, you do not need to know every single part of Israeli history in order to have your facts. You do not have to. You do not have to be a walking encyclopedia, a walking Wikipedia page, Jewish virtual library. You don't have to. What you need to do is really think through what are some of the biggest claims being made against Israel or Israelis. And there are lists. They pretty much boil down to a handful of categories. And with your reframe, you just want 2 to 3 points, 2 to 3 facts that you're going to respond, that you're going to utilize in your response to provide that context. So if we were to take this same claim, Israel is indiscriminately causing the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. What might be 2 or 3 facts that you want to use to debunk that point? Nothing has to be polished. This is just where we're working it out together. We're in it together.
Do you mind repeating that last part again, just so we could have it fresh in our brains?
Yeah. What are 2 to 3 facts you would use to explain why innocent Palestinians are suffering in the Gaza Strip?
Perhaps that it has a lot to do with their own, let's say, leaders.
Exactly. Who is responsible for the people in the Gaza Strip? Whatever governing body they have. At this point in time, that's Hamas, a terrorist organization that is mainly interested in causing the suffering and eventual end of the Jewish state. The last thing on their minds is protecting their people. How does that play out? That includes having terrorist infrastructure near hospitals and kindergartens. It includes using their people as human shields. If they know Israel is about to drop a bomb on a building, because Israel will tell them that they're going to do that in order to minimize civilian casualties, Hamas will tell the people living in that area, oh, go hang out on the rooftop. Go up there so that Israel will either be inclined to not take that action anymore, or they'll be stuck killing innocent people. They're basically putting the IDF in a very difficult situation for a call to make. But those are 2 very strong facts that most people don't know, that people are suffering at the hands of their governing body. Another thing you might want to say is how Israel, on the other side, invests so much in protecting its people, like with Iron Dome, incredible technology that intercepts missiles before they reach their people. You could even say how crazy it is that one government is putting its people in harm's way, if you could even call it that, after a military coup where Hamas took over. And then another government is forced to spend money protecting its people from threats like this that no other country really has to deal with. So those might be some of the facts you would include in your refrain, but it doesn't end there.
Rena?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I was just going to throw out there that maybe even more persuasive in that last, when you're talking about Israel, is to also to talk about the things that Israel actually does for the Palestinian people. Right? I mean, there are countless examples of Israel helping to provide water, of providing jobs. So you're not just focusing on what Israel does for Israel's own people, right? But also what Israel does to try to help the very people whose suffering we're talking about, right? And there's just countless examples. So anyway, just throw that out there as an additional thing that I think, again, if you've got that as a factual basis, it becomes much harder then to stick to that staunch position that the suffering of the Palestinians is entirely the fault of Israel.
Exactly. Those are also excellent points, that Israel takes on the responsibility of caring for Palestinians that don't live within Israel proper, but they still take that responsibility upon themselves. So sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to say also, I wanted to say very important that Israel is not only, even if you have to explain them, those people, they need to also know that their leaders don't let them know that Israel is helping not only in electricity or water, they're helping the sick, cancer, doctors, giving them jobs, that they allow those people to enter through passes, to learn music, because in Israel they have very, very high technology and teachers to teach certain children that have very good things, like the violin that they play. They let there was now recently on the Israeli news that they let this boy, that he was married an Arab. He was Arab and his wife was from Russia, and their child was a very, very good pianist. Israel allowed their son to come on a weekly basis to learn from a very, very, very big teacher in Israel, to learn to be a big pianist. And a lot of things that they allow. We are not the problem that we don't understand. We allow them to teach in the schools in Israel. Arab teachers, they're Arab from those cities to come teach Arabic in the schools. They don't want to open and listen to our views and we are open to make peace. We are open to learn their language. The problem is that they feed them all the negative and all this lies that how it's very hard for they're in a lie. They're living in a lie. And the problem is it's hard for us to break this thing that I don't know, to break it, like how are we going to educate them? We are educated. We don't need education. We have the education. We know the truth. The problem is they are not educated. They are not. They are believing and teaching their families and their children more and more lies. And this is the problem,
Yeah.
It's a big problem.
If I could just interject for a second, those are all things that I think that most of us feel on a regular basis when this type of discussion comes up. The really critical thing about this method that Rena's teaching is that it's fact-based first, right? And so, if you go back to the A, R, and the M, after you've addressed what the concern is that's been raised in the part that we're in right now, in the reframing, how critical it is that what you're giving are just 2 or 3 facts. So it takes the emotion out of it, because this is a very emotional topic, right, that we're talking about. And so if you take the emotion out of it and just try to have a more factual based conversation and discussion, that's kind of the key to this reframing. Go ahead, Rena. Sorry.
If you think about it, there's a concept in journalism: if it bleeds, it leads. So anytime there's a news story that's going to sound super dramatic, like Israel indiscriminately causing the suffering of Palestinians, that's something that's going to make the news more often than a story about Israeli-Palestinian cooperation. That's something we have to know right off the bat. And that's what this skill is all about. It's if someone reads something like that or hears something like that, of course they're going to get upset. Anyone who has no idea what's going on, who has no context about the conflict or who the players are or what anything means, of course they're going to read headlines like that and it's going to make them sick to their stomach. You're there to help walk them off that ledge. You're there to help provide that context, not by first saying, well, you're wrong, that's not actually what's happening, but really addressing their concern, reframing it with your facts, and then ending on a positive message. Something you'd like to see for the future, some common value, again, that you share as a way to keep things open for more conversation. A really nice message that I like to use for this claim of Israel causing this suffering of Palestinians in Gaza is, I really believe that the Palestinian people deserve a government that's going to care for their lives just as Israel does. And I'm sure that's something you and I want to see real soon. That might be how I'm going to close it off. I'm bringing it back to that common value we have, something that I like to see. And at the end of the conversation, if you are a rational person, you're going to see I'm not that different than you. And then if there are harder questions or conversations we're getting into, we've built trust. You see who I am, you see where I stand, you see that these things I care about are things you care about too. I want to offer a little caveat though. If someone tells you Israel is an apartheid state, practicing apartheid, causing the suffering of Palestinians, when it comes to addressing, that's your spot, that's your moment to share, again, what things you have in common with that person. And as Carly said, if you can be transparent with your own opinions too, if there are things that Israel's doing that you don't like, you don't have to pretend those things aren't happening. But if when it comes to something like as big as apartheid, you don't want to address it by saying, I could see why you'd think that. And sometimes I think Israel's acting a little apartheidy also. I see it, right? If that's not a common value you have, do not make up a common value. Don't do it. How do you address what someone's saying in that case, in that scenario, if there's no common ground? Carly mentioned this earlier. Ask questions. Get to know this person. wow, I see you care a lot about this. You use the word apartheid. Can you tell me what it means? Can you define it for me? I know it's a big word. I hear it a lot. I'd love to know how you define it. 8 times out of 10, you will find that the person using that term has no clue what it means. Even the most prominent anti-Israel campus activists, I've seen it myself multiple times, do not know the real definition of apartheid. They know these are sexy terms to put together. They're fighting for social justice. This is woke, this is cool. So that's what I'm going to regurgitate. So by asking those questions, you're investing the time in that person, similar to what you would do if you were finding common value. You're showing this person, I want to get to know you more, why you care about this thing, I care about it too. But by asking those questions, you're also buying yourself a bit of time to organize your response, and you're allowing yourself to see where they come from. Is this someone who has been studying this for years? Is this someone who heard this and picked it up off social media? And that's going to allow me also to address it properly by knowing who I'm talking to. Sorry, Carly, I cut you off.
No, I'm sorry. I thought you were pausing, and I apologize for interrupting you. I was just going to say that as you were talking, the thing that struck me is that by asking those questions, and certainly, doing it in a non-defensive, not a combative kind of, hey, can you even define that word? But just, what do you mean by apartheid? So that you can get to to a level playing field, right? Okay, now we know what we mean by that word. That's when that kind of gives you the opportunity then to address, because if they tell you what they mean by apartheid, they're really telling you what their real concern is, right? They may not have the right definition of apartheid, but they're telling you that, say, well, the Palestinian people have to go through a checkpoint, right? Or, so whatever it is. And then that gets you to the point of being able to, okay, now I know what to address and where we can maybe find some common ground. Now that we've gotten out of the way the misconceptions about what is apartheid, what isn't, because that's not really, most people, what apartheid is and isn't really the crux of it. It's that they feel like people are being treated badly and unfairly, or they've heard that. And so maybe you get into what apartheid really is and what it isn't, or maybe you just cut directly to oh, okay, I hear that you're concerned about X, Y, or Z, you've addressed it, and now you get to go right into the reframing. So a lot of times those questions at the outset will help you to get to that, all right, what is it that I even need to address?
Exactly. I know we're running short on time, so I'm just going to offer a little bit of a wrap up. Utilizing ARM when you hear about something that makes you very emotional, and the conversations around Israel make us very emotional because we know how much we care, is something very difficult to do. Taking a step back, taking a deep breath in, and preparing to not rectify a wrong, but start a conversation is something that's very difficult to do. It's totally against our instincts. If you touch something hot, your instinct is step away from it. It's not to talk it through until it cools down, right? It's not our initial reaction. It's not our knee-jerk reaction, but it's something so critical to practice. Because even in the classroom, when I knew that what that professor said was wrong, and I knew that Israel has 3,000-year-old indigenous presence of Jewish people, and that to say that we don't belong there when we're one of the oldest people from there makes no sense, right? I knew these things in my heart, but I couldn't say them because my first instinct was to tell her she's wrong, but I knew in a classroom setting that's not going to fly. She's the professor, I'm student. It's one of the first few days of class. It's not really going to work out the way I think it will. Using this methodology, ARM, requires practice. What I want to send you off with as like this call to action, a little bit of homework, is practice it. I'm putting in the chat one of our most popular booklets. It's Answering Tough Questions About Israel. And it does an amazing job of summarizing what some of the most common claims are with little bits of facts you can use to respond. Now that's what you say. What you want to practice is how you say it. So I would encourage you, find a friend, and try it out. Try some of the toughest things you've heard or questions you have yourself and how you might use this methodology. Remember, you want to address, reframe, and message. And it's going to really either help you get through to the person you're talking to, or could help you influence the people around you. How many of you have seen a Facebook status that's on some controversial topic and there are like hundreds of comments, people going back and forth, arguing about something? Yeah. People are watching all the time. So even if the person you're talking to is really not biting what you're selling, they're not buying it, they're not interested, think about all the other people that could be learning just from you. Think of the example you would set in any environment you are in with these skills. I think, Carly, you have anything last that you want to add before we wrap up?
No, I think that was fantastic. And again, just want to thank you all for being here. And also, I guess the one thing I would say is if you use any of these tools and you see that they are effective, please let us know. Let us know about, we hear all the time the negative, right? And this is largely why we're doing what we're doing, and we're needing to educate people. It's so nice to hear when some of this actually takes root and works. So, if you have experiences where you're able to use the ARM method or use some of our resources, and you realize that any change has happened, please let us know. And I think that's the crucial thing. Any change. If you're talking to someone who is clearly anti-Israel or seems to have this staunchly negative view of Israel or some aspect of Israel, your goal should not necessarily be to win them over completely in a conversation. If you get in a conversation like this and somebody walks away even just saying, "Oh, I didn't know that. I'll have to read more about that. I'll have to think about that," that's a win. And so take that, and then maybe you can build from that later, but don't feel the need to beat them over the head until they're saying, "Oh my goodness, when can I go to Israel?" That's not necessarily going to happen in that initial conversation. So be patient with it too.
I just want to say thank you to Rena and Carly for having this workshop. And if you guys are more interested in getting more involved, follow us on Instagram, Enough is Enough, and Stand With Us. And we're going to have more events like this, more workshops. And yeah, thank you guys for joining.
Thank you. It's only the beginning from here. So stay tuned for more incredible programs and amazing things to come from Enough is Enough. And Stand With Us is so excited to be partnering with you. So thank you.
Only the beginning.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very informative. Thank you.